Hello everyone. My name is Nat, and today I want to urge you to stop breaking things. Everything is broken, and it's broken pretty much all of the time. I want to explain to you what I mean by this, and how things break, and why it's your fault. When things are broken server-side, it's quite often quite easy to tell. Your users will tell you. Your server probably has error login set up. So whenever you get things like 500s and 404s, you will probably know about those straight away. Large companies have engineers always on call, ready to deal with those crises. So you're often aware of those things in a sort of like really visible way. You know, either you get complaints from people using your site or your automated systems tell you about it. And there's a whole culture around preventing server-side errors. There are things like, you know, automated logging, testing your code, automated testing, you know, as you build stuff, or automated testing when you deploy, and so on. Automated deploy systems to reduce number of sort of human errors being introduced this way. All sorts of reporting and monitoring strategies that can tell you whether the performance is currently good or not, and so on. So all those things are very valid approaches when it comes to reducing sort of things being broken server-side. And there are, you know, established good practices, and there are lots of tools that can help you with it, and so on. So let's say you do your best to prevent server-side things, and you know your code is relatively reliable and bug-free. And Casper talked about Dart, and Dart introducing static typing that can help you reduce your front-end bug code. And there are lots of new tools coming out that help you test your front-end JavaScript so that you can reduce the number of bugs that way. So you know the things that back-end developers already know and loved are sort of starting to make their way into the front end, and we're starting to have a lot more reliable code, or at least we can prove that it's more reliable nowadays. So you have all this set up, you know, you have some testing, or you have, you know, you use all those cool tools that help you know what's going on, and so on. So things are looking really good now, right? Wrong. To the visitor, it doesn't matter whether things are broken server-side, or because the server returns an error, or whether things are just not working correctly. If somebody's just trying to do something and they can't do it, then they don't really care whether the error is a server-side error, whether your front-end code is buggy, or whether simply it's something else breaking the thing, or whether it's, you know, poor network connection, or so on. For things to feel broken, they don't need to generate any errors server-side, or even generate any client-side errors. So I want to show you a little bit about, this is sort of a slideshow of things I've collected very recently, but what does it look like for things to fail on the front end. Twitter often breaks in a myriad of unexpected ways. A lot of user interface elements sometimes just completely stop working and become unresponsive. Notifications often persist even though you've read the notifications, and so on. So there's like lots of stuff always going wrong there. Links to various pages just reload the page instead of actually taking you where you're trying to be, indicating that some JavaScript there is not executing properly. Here's another kind of thing being broken. Web phones often take so long to load over 3G that eventually I just give up on trying to read something on the train. Mobile Twitter loads so much stuff over my 3G connection whenever I'm trying to view a single tweet, 140 characters. Often this happens. Sorry, something went wrong. You were able to load this many characters, but you can't load the tweet for me. Another interesting blog post that somebody sent me a link to, and I gave up on reading it because I just couldn't bear to wait this long to read some text that is already loaded and already within the page, and in theory I could read it, but I can't. here the text has already loaded and it's being displayed. However, the UI is so incredibly confusing that it needs extra labeling to explain you how you're supposed to read the text, and it leaves me so incredibly confused and angry that I just give up. I'm like, fine, keep it to yourself. This often happens to me with Dropbox. It loads everything apart from the stuff I actually care about, my files. I was visiting NodeBB forums. I was trying to find out how easy it is to template them, because I was figuring out whether one of my clients should use that for one of their products, and I was presented with this. This is a screenshot of CityMapper, which is a service that helps you route around the city using a combination of all available public transport. And when I first moved to London, it was still a very small company and only had an iOS app, and that really helped me learn my way around London. But often when I try to decide what route to take when I'm going out in the evening or whatever, and I use the web version, I am just greeted with a really ugly blue. Spotify search results. Not only do I not get any actual results to select the tune from, but I can't even use the interface elements that are already present in the page. Whenever I tried to play the track that's already been loaded, it was not possible. Going to other sections wasn't possible because none of the links were actually active anymore. Google Plus Photos, a photo sharing place. As Google describes, it's a place to connect with friends and family and explore all of your interests, presumably as long as those interests include large areas of flat color. Sony Entertainment Network, after logging in, very minimalist. However, I still don't know whether I have anything left on my account. The Verge, turns out that they load images with JavaScript into the page. They don't actually insert them into HTML. So the page has already loaded, but none of the images exist. And by the way, this is on my home Wi-Fi, so this isn't on a crappy 3G connection. So occasionally it just means I don't get to see any of the images. And last one, just to finish off, a news article somebody sent me from Al Jazeera that I haven't been able to read because I've run out of patience before the fonts had the chance to load. To just defend Twitter for a moment, because it always causes me a lot of frustration, for all the awfulness of the desktop website, at least the fonts are, like some fonts are displayed really early on, even before the fancy ones are loaded. So some of my friends and I always joke that websites from 2007 were simply better. In 2007, I was 21, and I've been making websites for over 12 years, or just about 12 years, something like that. So me and my friends have this joke running that 2007 was the absolute pinnacle of achievement in terms of web development. A lot of social networks already existed, but they were still figuring out how to be just really, really good at something. And they weren't yet thinking so much about, you know, how to sell data to advertisers, what sort of data to collect, how to monetize their product. They were still sort of, you know, a lot of them were still in a phase where they had some money and they were just able to commit it to building some cool stuff. In 2007, it was also commonplace to think that of course you own your data, and of course you want to be able to get it back in lots of different formats, so a lot of services were really kind in that way as well. And, you know, things just sort of worked. What do I mean by that? Let's look at an example. In 2007, if you wanted to upload a picture to Flickr, you could just do it without fuss. When you visited a pictures page, you were presented with a picture, and you could look at it, and you could read its description, and see the comments, and maybe find out more about it. So you could do lots of other things, but let's just focus on being able to upload and look at the picture. In 2014, Tom Morris, a Wikipedia admin, tried uploading a picture to Flickr. What followed was enough to fill a long, angry blog post. Upload page didn't render correctly. The image uploaded said didn't go very smoothly. And when then Tom reloaded the page, the image was broken. He saw a very pixelated version of an image, which presumably was to be later refreshed for a sort of higher resolution version with JavaScript, but that didn't happen. So the result was a broken page with a broken image, and some of the UI didn't work even after the refresh. So even if those errors weren't necessarily caused by Flickr or bugs in their code, they sort of add up to this feeling that Flickr is thoroughly broken. A photo sharing site doesn't allow you to actually upload a look at the photo. So let's break down different ways in which people assume that things are broken, even if those aren't caused by your errors. First thing I want to talk about is accessibility of your site. Accessibility is a huge topic, but it doesn't take much effort to make your sites accessible to people with varied needs and various access controls. Generally speaking, what I like about being concerned about accessibility is that any improvements you make things better for everyone. So let's run through some common ways in which people with disabilities especially use the computers slightly differently to majority, and by extension use the web slightly differently. Screen reading software relies on semantic information within the page to help people with sight problems to navigate the page. At Eurocamp earlier this year, or this summer even, I went to see a talk by Austin Serafin, who's an accessibility consultant and a developer. And he was talking about how when he first bought an iPhone, it really changed his life, and lives of many other blind people he knows. And the iPhone did so by simply baking in accessibility features by default. Suddenly things that used to be very difficult and required either specialized software made by small teams or specialized hardware that is often very expensive, suddenly became possible. The standard building blocks of iOS applications are accessible by default. So as long as the developer uses those, they don't have to know anything about making things accessible. And they don't even have to know that they're doing it. It just simply happens by default. And Austin described a situation where he was using an app that seemed to be working, and he was trying to accomplish a task. And sort of halfway through, he realized that some of the UI elements created within the app were no longer using the sort of default components, and the new UI elements weren't enhanced with any accessibility features, and he wasn't able to finish the task. And as he was telling this story, I sort of started thinking, like really sweating, and started thinking, oh my God, have I ever done anything with any websites I've ever built that, could have been semantic, could have just worked by default, and have I just broken it accidentally by not thinking about it? So it was like a horrible moment trying to figure out whether I've done that also. Austin's talk will be on Eurocamp's website at some point when the videos come out. I strongly suggest you watch it because it's absolutely brilliant. But the cool thing is that by sticking to semantic HTML, you at least know that you covered the basics. So you know that content can be parsed by a screen reader. When you invent new UI components that are not necessarily semantic, there are also a number of things you can do to mitigate the fact that they're not necessarily accessible by default. So enhancing rich interfaces is really simple with ARIA roles, which I don't know whether you pronounce them like that, because I've never heard anybody pronounce them. But they make screen readers aware of what the elements are supposed to be doing, what the roles are, and thus make help the screen reader make sense of the content and interactions. Some people can only use the web using a keyboard or a single switch access tool. So if you hijack keyboard controls or break them in any way, then you basically make those sites inaccessible for all those people. And again, I think this is a good example that if you don't break keyboard accessibility, then it's good for everybody, because we all often use keyboard by default instead of a mouse. For people with hearing problems, it's important to provide content in a way that can be actually experienced. So audio and video things need to have transcripts and captioning. And again, I almost never watch videos of talks, for example, or product demos or things like that, because it's often like a huge time commitment to either watch 10 minutes of something or half an hour or something. It has to be like a really special case for me to watch that. But if there is a transcript, I will read it in a few minutes and I will get the content. So it's especially important for things like product demos and things that explain how your things work. Testing for accessibility is also really easy these days. Especially screen readers, you can enable VoiceOver if you're using a Mac, which makes things super easy. So I want to talk a little bit about how testing for accessibility can actually surface some interesting things. Gov.uk is a UK government organization, which is a sort of like a big software team made up of people developing software and people designing software who are redesigning all government's website, and they're redesigning them with user needs in mind rather than the government needs, which is sort of really groundbreaking, because in the government, as you can imagine, that is obviously quite difficult. But they've been making lots of really amazing things, and their approach to design and development is really impressive. And they always talk on their blog a lot about their processes and their findings and things they discover, so they're really, really good. And in one of their blog posts, Alice Bartlett, who's a front-end developer, she was making improvements to the search experience. And during testing, she noticed that the new improvements made the screen reader access worse. Because what she's done is, when you start typing your search query, a field full of search results automatically updates, and she just added an ARIA role to the search field that said that, okay, whenever the content updates here, because it sort of relies on you visually being able to tell that something's changed, whenever the content is updated, please read it out. But obviously, that sounds like a good idea at first, but whenever search results were being loaded in, the software would start reading out all of them, and every time you would type something, they would sort of get read out from the beginning again. So Alice instead decided that she could just add a component that would designate the results count, and that would be read out automatically whenever something changes, so the visitor would know that now they can interact with another element in the page and find it for the screen reader to read out. So this solution is really simple, but it would have been really difficult to stumble upon without trying it out first, and all it takes is just enabling one feature on a computer you already use. Another thing that can make things really inaccessible is your use of language and tone. And again, Gov.uk, they've compiled a list of words and phrases to avoid. Some of them are because they're offensive to some people. Another are sort of banned from all government content because they're not necessarily easily understood, or they're weasel words, or they don't necessarily convey the right meaning, or they don't convey the meaning in the simplest possible terms. And they've decided that, for people with dyslexia, for example, or reading difficulties or learning disabilities, it's a lot easier for them to understand content when it's written in simple and plain English, but also that has a brilliant effect on everybody visiting the website, because they can all sort of get the gist of the content much quicker than they normally could. It's important to think about the language, because some language might be deliberately exclusionary. There's been research done about how wording in job adverts can put off especially women from applying for certain jobs, because the language that is presented sort of makes it sound like they wouldn't be necessarily welcome. And this doesn't always have to be a bad thing. You might use language in a way that excludes the kinds of people that you don't want to be visiting your site. There are certain communities, for example, on the web that are tight-knit, and they are so because they sort of keep their little community together, and they develop their own language. So the initial hurdle to join the community is obviously tricky, because you have to learn sort of new jargon, but perhaps that is a positive thing. So another thing that breaks things is our problems with connectivity. This is a picture taken in my garden. When the weather is nice, I work from home sometimes, and sometimes I sit in the garden. And there's a part, which is in this photograph, where I'm completely in the shade. But it's quite close to the house, so I still got a really strong Wi-Fi signal. But the speed of connection isn't very good. Whenever I have to look something up, I have to wait for ages for the web page to load, and like I get constantly disconnected from Slack. There's another bit in the garden where it's really sunny and really nice, but over there, download speeds drop very drastically, and there is no hope of accessing almost anything, not Twitter for sure, and not Medium. Some of the man pages and like old Linux guides are still accessible, however. I also have a proper office. I use it about half the time. And in my office, the internet connection is absolutely terrible. It's really bad on the cable, but Wi-Fi is even worse. Like there's almost no hope of streaming audio or video. On a good day, your connection doesn't drop all of the time, so you know at least it's sort of bearable. And on a bad day, it's just astonishing. And this is an office in a co-working space occupied by designers, artists, and software developers in a part of London that's trendy with the tech community, and yet good connection is very hard to come by. And also, I've worked in other offices where sometimes it was much faster to just tether to my phone on 3G than to use the Wi-Fi available. I often also do work from hotels, and I travel quite a lot and work on the train, and obviously that makes it even worse. But even before I sort of during my normal day get to the office, I get a train from this station, and the train usually goes over Grand, but you can't tell by the quality of the signal because it's so bad. In the London Underground, we have now installed Wi-Fi. It was done for the Olympics so that we could wow the visitors, but obviously the Wi-Fi on the tube is pretty bad, and it's only installed in the stations. So as soon as you start moving off, you lose it, and by the time you get to the next station, it takes forever to connect. So it's, you know, it's a terrible, excruciating experience. And as I was actually looking for this image on my Instagram, all the links became unresponsive, and I had to reload the page to find the photo I wanted. So that just confirms that. So also, I don't think connectivity is the only thing. Sometimes people also assume that, you know, working in tech, not only do I have amazing broadband, but I also have a really fast computer. This is a computer I was using until very recently. It was a 2009 unibody MacBook. Developing a site utilizing web audio APIs on it was really painful, and transcoding video on it was really painful, and most websites, JavaScript would just bring it to a halt, and it was really difficult to use anything. Why am I telling you this? I've heard often opinions from other developers that, you know, a lot of people work on products that are targeted at sort of people in the tech industry or businesses in the tech industry. So it's quite common to hear assumptions that, you know, oh, everybody has fast broadband, so these images can be really big, or, you know, our target market uses the latest and greatest in the hardware, so, you know, we can assume that they all have really fast computers and really good phones, and, you know, we can run lots of JS and we won't run into performance issues because, you know, it's all cutting edge. And these assumptions might be partially true, but you know, I work in London, in a European capital, and I work in the tech industry, and those things don't really hold true for me. And not necessarily for my friends either. So if you can't guarantee that your assumptions sort of match up with reality for even a small demographic, then I don't think you can do for others either. A corollary to that is excessive page load time, but I want to talk about this separately because even though it's worsened by terrible internet connection, it can be a problem by itself. So me and my friends sometimes talk about this idea of time to text, which is how long it takes you from the moment you try to load the page until you can read the text on it. I'm not the first one to propose it, obviously, and it's been adopted from sort of similar metric that some of my friends in the broadcasting industry used to describe the time it takes for sort of user-generated content sites to suddenly have content that needs to be moderated. So let's load a blog post on Medium from a link in my email over my home Wi-Fi and see how long that takes. That was 8.1 seconds until the point I can read something on my home Wi-Fi. And let's load a single tweet, 140 characters over 3G connection. while in my house. .4 seconds. Now, there's obviously, I keep saying 140 characters, just a single tweet, 140 characters, because I'm sort of obsessed by this idea that I care about that 140 characters. This is what I'm coming to this site for. And what I get is basically a lot of waiting for something that should be blazing fast. So what I did is I removed everything from that tweet page that I wasn't interested in, just left the tweet and the author name and their username, put it on my own server with no CSS and no JavaScript, and tried to load it over my 3G. It's still quite long, it's 4 seconds. It doesn't get any compression on my server, but it's already half the time. Now, you might say that, you know, it's unfair to say that, oh, okay, you can remove everything else and then be like, oh, now it loads really fast. And because of course it would load really fast. But when I really want to read a tweet, when I'm somewhere and I'm trying to do something, I might be in a hurry or I might be really interested in something. You know, in this instance, I care about the words and ideas being transferred from one mind to another. I don't care about being able to favorite things. I don't care about being able to stream things. I don't care about all these things that people at Twitter think are super important to their app. All I care is about this, and like this is very difficult to get, and I have to wait over 8 seconds to read that. I think it's quite excessive. And if you think that, you know, you can make your visitors care about those things that are sort of side things to what they're actually trying to do, you're wrong. Just an example. This is a screenshot I took on the train, and at the top you can see that my network's dropped and I no longer have access to the internet, but the stuff I care about has already loaded, and it loaded first, you know? I can already read the whole news article, and it's already, you know, it already works great on my phone because stripped of CSS and JavaScript, it's just responsive by default. And, you know, it doesn't matter that I no longer have the connection, and it doesn't matter to me that this time it looks really ugly or that this time there are no super cool JavaScript enhancements. I just don't care. All I want to do is read. And, you know, when I'm sitting at home and I'm at my big desk and I'm looking at the nice Medium post, I do care about the images and I do care about beautiful typography, but there are contexts in which these things are absolutely secondary to the things that I actually trying to accomplish. So let's look at page size for some of the common services. I looked at one of the posts on Medium by Sasha Grief. It was really good. It has some really nice images. And when I downloaded it, compressed, it was over 1,000 kilobytes, which is, you know, quite heavy. And in the UK, when you go over my data plan, to download that, it would cost me over nearly 23 pence. And if I were in America and I had to use data roaming, it would cost me this much. To load a single tweet, over 435 kilobytes gzipped. In the UK, it would cost me nearly 9 pence, which is, you know, not too bad for 140 characters. How much is that per character? It's good value. And if I did that abroad in America, that would cost me over £2 to read a single tweet. Now, my blog, which is by no means a good example of front-end development, if you download one of the blog posts, it's 25 kilobytes. In the UK, that would cost me half a pence on my data plan, and abroad, 12.5 pence. So a bit better. So I want to talk a little bit about JavaScript, because I know Kenneth at least was waiting for this. Someone on Hacker News asked recently a question about why would anyone want to disable JavaScript in their browser? And the post reads, base info, I'm a front-end dev born in the early 90s with 3 years experience. A lot of older devs that I've worked with have told me that best practice includes making sure that site is usable even if you got JavaScript disabled. To me, this is completely bonkers. Are we really supposed to cater to the sub 2% that chooses not to use JavaScript? So there's this assumption that most people don't turn off JavaScript on purpose. But the people that do are not worth paying attention to because they're paranoid, tinfoil hat wearers, and they made this choice knowing the trade-off. So they chose it because they have a reason to. And therefore, that somehow equates to thinking that, okay, well, if we don't have to worry about this demographic because they choose to do that, then it's perfectly safe to assume that JavaScript is always available and always present. So we should, use it to, make the most of it. And just to be super boring, I'm going to use a Gov UK example again because they've done really amazing research that sort of measured how many people have JS available in the browser. And then it devised an experiment which allowed them to separate data from visitors who have JS available at all, but for whatever reason it didn't run. Separated them from people who have JavaScript either explicitly disabled or the browser isn't at all capable of rendering it. So they loaded an image inside the HTML. They had another image inside a no-script tag, and then they had another image that they loaded via JavaScript on page load, thus segmenting the results so they could see what is the total of people loading the page, total of people not having JavaScript available, and total of people who executed JavaScript correctly. 1.1% of people didn't get any JavaScript enhancements, and they did it on their homepage, which gets obviously a lot of views, and that seems like a small number. But in case of Gov UK, that's obviously that's 1 in 93 people, and in case of Gov UK, because they have so many visits every day, that actually means quite a lot of people didn't get those. However, this number doesn't necessarily represent people who have explicitly disabled JS. So of the total, only 0.2% disabled JS, meaning that only 0.2% of people haven't been capable of executing JavaScript. 0.9% of visitors, their browsers were capable of executing JavaScript, but didn't. So this is a proportion of people who don't get a choice. They don't make an active choice to turn it off. Potentially, they might be waiting for a pretty good enhanced experience. And it seems like a maybe small percentage, but when you consider sizes of certain websites, that might not be a small enough number to accept that this is the number of failures we're going to get all the time. Certainly the government can't afford that. So why might JavaScript not execute correctly and cause problems even when it's explicitly available? Well, there are lots of causes. One of them is JavaScript errors. Of course, your code might not be very well written. It might have bugs in it, or it might have you might have pushed something accidentally with errors to production. But it's not always your fault. Sometimes the third-party libraries will contain some code that is broken. If the visitor is using any browser tools like extensions or toolbars, those can introduce JavaScript errors, and sometimes one of them is enough to take the whole thing down. There are other things outside of visitors' control. Corporate, school, and many public Wi-Fi's, the networks restrict what can be accessed over them and how. And that can include parental filters, which may exclude some JavaScript or all JavaScript. It really depends. Then we have network errors. Perhaps some of the files haven't downloaded or only downloaded partially. Perhaps AJAX requests are failing and there's no error handling in place. Or maybe your infinite scroll only works when the connection is quite stable, but when it's intermittent, maybe it silently fails. Or even worse, maybe it fails in a way that forces the visitor to start from the very beginning. One of my friends, Paul Buckley, recently said that he was trying to use Pivotal Tracker and couldn't because 1.7 megabytes of JavaScript was being downloaded over a very slow network, and it basically couldn't finish. So when people in tech industry cannot access websites because they have requirements that simply cannot be met, then it's very difficult to imagine how majority of people can use the sites as well. Now, not every device is capable of processing the JavaScript that you send to it, even if it's capable of receiving it in good time. Many of the lower-end sort of smartphones and tablet devices, might have memory problems when you try to run too much stuff. So not always they can deal with what you throw at them. And even if scarce memory doesn't mean your code won't run at all, it might run so slowly as to be basically impossible for the visitor to detect whether things are broken or just really slow, and it will feel broken anyway. Maybe your CDN is down and libraries you depend on are no longer available. Maybe your own files are being delivered by a CDN and they're not available. And then obviously there are browsers that aren't capable of executing JavaScript, but you might still care about them for some of the sites. Maybe you care about some of the search engine crawlers that aren't necessarily ones capable of executing JavaScript. Or maybe you do care about access via command line tools. Maybe you do care about embedded devices being able to poll your site and do some scraping and stuff. And this is why I think a single-page web app approach with rendering HTML client-side especially, for a lot of projects can be a terrible choice. Without server-side HTML rendering, there's nothing to fall back on when your JavaScript, for whatever reason, does not execute as expected. And now, sometimes that is okay. Different projects have different challenges and different goals. I studied design at university. I've only become developer sort of halfway through my design course. And one of the lecturers at the design course told me this really good quote, that there's no such thing as objectively good design. There is only design that works for some people in some contexts at a sort of given time. And in the same way, I don't think there's like one correct approach to building things on the web. So there's no such thing as like, oh, this is a bad approach, or like, oh, this is a really good approach. Like these approaches have their pros and cons, and they're useful for different kinds of things. So what might be right for one project will be the worst possible approach for another. And just because I've slightly ranted about JavaScript, I don't want you to think that I'm wholly against client-side render HTML and doing JS apps. I write JavaScript as a day job, but I just think that in a lot of cases that I've seen them in so far, they're not necessarily the best tool for the job. And just to sort of illustrate how you have to sort of explicitly make those decisions about what tools you use and what approaches you use, Bustle, I thought, was a content site. It has like posts on fashion, current affairs, entertainment, and so on. And they're sort of in the form of short blog posts or news articles with like pictures and some multimedia stuff. And I thought that, you know, as a content website, surely it works without JavaScript. But it doesn't. Whenever you explicitly disable JavaScript, no content is served to you at all. And I was like, sort of a bit confused. Like, why would a content site limit on purpose what people can see, like how many people can access the content, based on like a really arbitrary criteria of JS not being available? But then I realized that in this case, Bustle isn't a content site, but is an ad delivery website. So without JS tracking and being able to tell where people are coming from and what they do and what their sort of demographic is and so on, they cannot sell them to advertisers. So it doesn't make financial sense for them to serve up any content to people who won't generate any income. So I think in that case, it's like a nice example of knowing what your needs are in this case and making a deliberate decision to exclude certain visitors in this case. Not that I agree with it, but it might have been a perfectly good decision for them. So how do you know whether it's fine for your site not to work when JS cannot, for whatever reason, be executed? Should you, for example, trust the what prominent leaders in the community say about various tools and approaches? Maybe you should then base it on consensus on Hacker News. Or maybe you should base it on a hunch. Or maybe there's like a long-held ideology that you like to base your decisions on. So maybe you should base it on like latest trends in new technologies. I don't think any of those things are good. I think the only right approach is designing for your audience. In order to do that, you need to really understand who your visitors are, what they need to accomplish, and what are the constraints of the project. And only knowing those things, you can make those decisions. And just as an aside, I think progressive enhancement lately has become sort of a dirty phrase, especially that a lot of people start assuming that, you know, we've entered a new era, JS is always available, it's perfectly fine to just assume that it's going to work. But I think this is a big mistake, because it's so often these things are out of your control, and you don't always have enough knowledge about your audience to make that assumption about them as well. So how do you know who your audience are? Obviously, you can measure things about them. You can collect data to help you sort of guide your decision making. But in order to sort of know what to measure, you need to know a lot about the project. So you need to know what your goals are, and you need to know what your possible approaches can be, and then you need to decide, sort of design what sort of data you need to collect. You also need to be careful about how you measure the data, because it's very easy to sort of collect lots of numbers and then be like, hey, I've got loads of numbers, I can make loads of decisions based on them. But it's important that you sort of take care about deciding how you're going to measure things, and whether those strategies give you sort of a good overview of what is it that you're trying to learn. And whenever you're collecting data, I think it's important that you learn a little bit about statistics. As a cautionary tale, I've heard the anecdote of a company making a very important strategic decision based on data that was collected for a very short time, where the difference between two different options that were being compared seemed very big, but because of the sample size, that difference was still within margin of error, and decision was made anyway. So you have to be careful not to get sort of seduced by numbers. And don't guess. Just go and find out what it is that, you know, people that potentially will be using your sites, you know, what they're like. Browser is obviously a very hostile environment. There are a lot of things you just don't have any control of. It's very fragmented. You know, when you're doing sort of backend stuff, it's really easy to design your perfect environment in which things you will be run, and you can tightly control all of the features. And it's very comforting to know that in the browser you sort of have to abandon hope. You don't really get to choose how things are run, and it's not enough to sort of do this and be like, oh, well, you know, I don't have any control over this, therefore there's nothing I can do. It's not true. There is stuff you can do, and there are things like you can mitigate all of those challenges I've just talked about by simply, I think, thinking about what your challenges are and how you can develop strategies to think about them. By default, I think your audience should be always everyone, unless you've established otherwise. When your site becomes a certain size and you're dominant in the market, I think you can then get away with sort of excluding people for a little bit, but you never get to being really big by purposefully making it difficult for people to be able to accomplish their tasks. So if you're going to make things difficult for parts of your potential audience, I think it needs to come from sort of a place where you understand how you made this decision, and you need to know that it's the right decision for your project. And finally, I want to end with a quote from David Hieatt, who's a co-founder of Do Lectures. He wrote a blog post entitled "What You make is what you stand for," which really resonated with me, because whenever your values always become somehow embedded in the things you make, so make sure that they represent you, and make sure that you always strive to make things as good as they can be. Thanks.
Thanks, Nat. So we have 5 minutes. Is there any questions that we think about? I don't see any hands. That's it. Let's give Nat a hand again. Thanks.